So what's like, so growing up, like where does, like hairdressing get into it then? Because like, growing up and all that stuff, like are you just into it from day one, or was it more of like a cultural thing that you're into as, and hairdressing is just a part of the culture that you grew up in?
So it is actually probably the antithesis of how I grew up. Being a child from the South, guys weren't hairdressers very often. They were barbers.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. That line was drawn pretty definitively. And I mean, I was kind of loosely infatuated with my barber as a young man, because he very much looked like the spitting image of Kenny Rogers from the 70s, that sort of thing. He was cool. He always, he seemed to do what he wanted,
right.
That sort of deal. And so apart from that, my parents were, we grew up in a rural community. They were from rural Mississippi. So I kind of grew up loosely kind of on a small, like just house-sustaining farm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We had pigs, we had chickens, we had an acre and a half of garden, dogs, cats, whatever. But unlike my parents, I found rock and roll like early. Like my mom liked Elvis and, that sort of thing. But I got into rock and roll in like the second grade. Yeah. And my parents were like, what has happened? You know what I mean? What has happened? Because, now I got, I'm a second grader. Right. And the story about that is, when I was in second grade, you had afternoon recess, right? And afternoon recess, I went to a consolidated school, which means that we had K through 8. Okay. All right. Kindergarten was in an annex building. 1 through 4 was in one wing. 5 through 8 was in another. So, and there was a big gymnasium, nice hardwood floors. I mean, it was crazy. And in afternoon recess, you could go to the gymnasium and for 10 cents, you could either get a fudgesicle, a chocolate milk, or a soda. So I walk into the gymnasium one day, and obviously the 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade kids worked that concession stand. And this girl was playing like this music on her radio, and I was like, what is that? Yeah. And she was, I'm, like I said, I'm second grade. She's 8th grade. She's like, oh, little man, that's Kiss. Have you never heard that? And I was like, no. And then within like a week, I had convinced my grandmother to buy my first rock and roll record for me. And then, you got Kiss posters all over the wall. And then by the time we moved to Oklahoma, I was definitely into, all kinds of other music and, so culture, yes. Yeah. Like my culture, going into high school, especially in Oklahoma, I found like an unwitting band of musicians and artists in Purcell, Oklahoma, which is where I graduated high school from. So, they play guitar, they play drums and whatnot. And we graduate high school, still, hair's never a thing, but I played guitar, and whatnot. And so we get out of school. I go to OU for a year. I absolutely hated college. I didn't really care for the culture. Again, what I mean? It's a culture thing. And a buddy of mine that I was working with, I was working a crappy job. I was in a warehouse working the night shift. It almost sounds like my uncle walked, 50 miles to school uphill and still barefoot. Yeah. But I was literally working the night shift in a warehouse loading semis and inside a freezer. So I was working in frozen, Yeah. And my buddy that I graduated high school with, he was like, hey, man. He was like, I know that I know you really don't want to go to college for 4 years. And I'm like, well, no, that does not. I mean, I'm 19. You know what I mean? And I'm like, no, that doesn't sound fun. He was like, have you ever considered doing hair? And I was like, no.
Like, what are you trying to say about me?
Right. You know, it was
almost an
kind
insult.
of coming from that, from
Right.
that very country culture,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. I was like, no. And he was like, no, man. No, listen.
Yeah.
He was like, you get to work when you want, essentially, make your own hours, which we all sooner or later very soon learn that that's a fallacy.
Because if you run your own business, there is no
right,
days off.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you work when your clients say you work,
Yes,
and I'm sure that you have the
Same
same
way,
thing.
yeah.
He's like, but you get to wear your hair the way you want, you get to wear clothes the way you want, and I was like, huh, all right,
Yeah.
So he was like, but there's 2 schools here in town. This was in Norman, Oklahoma. He's like, one school is very strict, like very strict. And then the other school is, which is where I'm going. He was telling the story. That's where I'm going. They're a little more relaxed, that sort of thing. So me knowing myself at that time enough to know I kind of needed, if I was going to go to school for something, I needed to go someplace where I was almost afraid not to go.
Gotcha.
Like they set such a culture that like you were afraid to no-show.
You needed strict.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because I was kind of, I was 19. I was kind of all over the place. I really didn't know what I would have loved to have been a musician, but I really, hated. I love the idea more than I love the practice.
The lifestyle and the way it looks. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you.
But so there was that element to it. So in hairdressing, you might say it was the actual culture that attracted me in the beginning. I had no idea if I could cut hair. As a matter of fact, when I first started cutting hair, it was extraordinarily difficult. A very common thing you see hairdressers do is it's what we call palming your shears, right? It's where you hold the shears and the comb in the same hand. Sure. You comb, you section the hair off, you pull it down, you move your comb from your dominant hand to your recessive hand, and then you make the cut. I couldn't do even that. And because I went to the stricter school, one of the things that I did not know was that this school, people were coming to from states away.
Wow. Okay.
So I was getting ready to, unbeknownst to myself, go to school with people that had grown up in hair salons, had parents that were hairdressers, that had wanted to be a hairdresser since they
had swept hair since they were 12, like the whole deal.
And here I am, like I thought it would be kind of cool.
Yeah, like what do I do with this hand and this hand?
Right. And my instructor for hair design was super patient. But at like day 5, he just comes over and says, he's like, and this was a Friday. He was like, I don't know what you have to do to be able to do this. Yeah. But if you can't do this, then you can't do this. And I was like, all right. So I kind of went home that weekend and like worked on it. But it was just it was the simplest and dumbest thing to not be able to do. But, I worked on it all weekend, kind of carried shears and a comb around with me for a bit to kind of get the feeling of that. Yeah. And then came back on Monday or on Tuesday, and it was a little bit different. Yeah. It was a little bit of a different world. So that's kind of the the background of what got me into hairdressing in the first place, and kind of where that came from.